Hello everyone and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Eric's world shatters in a way he never imagined possible the moment the truth about Taylor finally comes into the open. Because this is not just a confession, not just another scandal in a long history of Forrester family betrayals, but a seismic revelation that rewrites everything Eric thought he knew about loyalty, love, and the fragile architecture holding Ridge's life together. And as Taylor stands there, her voice trembling yet resolute, admitting that she has been carrying a secret lover. In the shadows of their already complicated lives, the weight of that truth crashes down on Eric with a force that leaves him stunned, breathless, and struggling to reconcile the woman he believed he knew with the reality unfolding before him. This is a moment years in the making, a slow-burning deception hidden behind professional smiles, moral lectures, and the familiar rhetoric of sacrifice and family values. And Eric, who has weathered countless storms of betrayal, affairs, and power struggles, realizes too late that this one cuts differently because it strikes at the heart of Ridge's emotional foundation, the very core of what Eric has always tried to protect as a father and patriarch. And as Taylor's confession continues, each word feels like a hammer blow, revealing not only the existence of the affair but the depth of it, the duration of it, and the deliberate choices made to keep Ridge in the dark. Choices that now echo with devastating clarity as Eric sees the full picture form in his mind. Ridge's world, already fragile from years of romantic turmoil, collapses under the weight of this revelation even before he fully comprehends it, because the implications ripple outward instantly, touching every unresolved wound, every past argument, every time Taylor positioned herself as the moral compass while quietly betraying the very ideals she claimed to uphold. And Eric watches his son's face fall, the devastation written in his eyes as disbelief turns to shock. Shock to anger, and anger to a hollow, soul-deep pain that no amount of wealth or power can shield him from. This is the kind of betrayal that rewrites memory itself, forcing Ridge to question every shared moment, every declaration of love, every plan for the future. And Eric feels a crushing sense of guilt because, as the elder statesman of the family, he prides himself on seeing the truth before it detonates. Yet this affair remained invisible to him, hidden behind Taylor's careful composure. And the family's collective desire for stability. As Taylor explains herself, attempting to contextualize the affair as something born of loneliness, emotional neglect, or unfulfilled needs, Eric hears not just her words but the echo of a familiar pattern that has plagued the family for generations. A pattern of justifying betrayal in the language of emotional necessity. And it infuriates him because he knows how deeply those justifications wound the people left behind, especially Ridge, whose romantic life has been a battlefield of divided loyalties and impossible choices for as long as Eric can remember. The confession changes everything because it strips away illusions, exposing the truth that even those who speak most passionately about integrity are capable of profound duplicity. And Eric is forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that Taylor's affair does not exist in isolation but is entangled with decades of unresolved emotional chaos, rivalries, and power struggles that have defined the family's history. As the identity of the secret lover becomes clear, the shock intensifies, because it is not merely the act of infidelity that devastates Ridge and stuns Eric, but the specific betrayal of trust implied by who Taylor chose. Someone whose presence now feels like a calculated violation rather than a momentary lapse. And Eric can see the precise instant when Ridge's internal world fractures, when the future he envisioned with Taylor disintegrates into a million irreparable pieces. This is not just heartbreak, it is an existential collapse, a reckoning with the idea that the emotional safe harbor Ridge believed he had found was built on a lie. And Eric feels a deep, aching sorrow not only for his son but for the family as a whole. Because he understands that this revelation will send shockwaves through every relationship, reopening old wounds with Brooke, reigniting rivalries, and reshaping alliances in ways that cannot be undone. Taylor's confession forces Eric to reassess his own role in enabling a culture of secrecy and forgiveness without accountability. And as he watches Ridge struggle to process the truth, he recognizes that the devastation unfolding is the inevitable result of years spent prioritizing appearances over honesty, stability over truth, and emotional comfort over hard conversations. The gravity of the moment hangs heavy in the room, thick with unspoken accusations and shattered expectations, and Eric's mind races through the consequences, the inevitable confrontations, the media fallout, the impact on the children, and the long road of emotional fallout that lies ahead. because in this family, no secret ever dies quietly. Ridge's devastation is not theatrical but deeply human, a quiet unraveling that terrifies Eric more than any explosive outburst could, because it signals a loss of faith not only in Taylor but in the very idea of lasting love. And Eric knows that rebuilding from this kind of collapse will require more than apologies or explanations. It will require a fundamental re-examination of values and truths that have been taken for granted for far too long. As the confession reaches its end, there is no sense of closure, only the heavy realization that nothing will ever be the same again, that the relationships they thought were solid are now irreversibly altered. And Eric stands there, stunned and shaken, bearing witness to a turning point that will define the family's future. Understanding with painful clarity that this is not merely a scandal to be managed or a crisis to be survived, but a transformative moment that forces every person involved to confront who they are, what they have sacrificed, and whether love built on fractured truths can ever truly be repaired. Because in learning the truth about Taylor, Eric also learns a deeper, more unsettling truth about the cost of secrets, the fragility of trust, and the devastating power of a single confession to bring an entire world crashing down. In the aftermath of that confession, the silence that follows is louder than any argument that could erupt, a suffocating stillness in which Eric feels the full magnitude of what has been unleashed settling into his bones. Because once the truth is spoken, it cannot be retracted, reshaped, or softened. And now every person in that room is forced to sit with the wreckage of it, watching Ridge struggle to remain upright as if the ground beneath him has shifted without warning. And Eric, who has seen his son endure public humiliations, romantic betrayals, and corporate wars, understands with aching clarity that this wound is different, deeper, because it cuts into Ridge's sense of self rather than merely his pride. Ridge does not lash out immediately, does not raise his voice or demand explanations, and that restraint terrifies Eric more than rage ever could, because it signals a man retreating inward, trying desperately to reconcile the woman he loved with the stranger who now stands before him. And as Ridge's eyes flicker between Taylor and the floor, Eric recognizes the look of someone re-examining his entire emotional history, replaying moments with new context, questioning gestures that once felt sincere but now seem rehearsed, and wondering how many times he was unknowingly competing with a ghost in his own relationship. Taylor, for her part, attempts to fill the silence with remorse, with apologies that spill out in halting fragments, insisting that she never intended to hurt Ridge, that the affair was a mistake born of vulnerability. But Eric hears the familiar cadence of regret that arrives only after exposure, and he cannot help but feel a bitter sting of disappointment, because intentions mean little when weighed against the consequences now unfolding. The room becomes a crucible where years of suppressed tension, unresolved rivalries, and emotional half-truths begin to surface. And Eric feels the crushing responsibility of being the one who must somehow hold the family together even as its internal structures crumble, knowing that what happens next will define not only Ridge's future but the moral trajectory of the Forrester legacy itself. As Ridge finally speaks, his voice low and measured, the words are few but devastating, questioning not just the affair but the integrity of everything Taylor ever represented to him. And Eric watches Taylor flinch as if struck, realizing too late that the true damage is not the loss of the relationship but the erosion of trust so complete that it leaves no foundation upon which reconciliation could realistically be built. Eric's thoughts drift to Brooke, to the long, painful history of triangulated love that has defined Ridge's life, and he understands with grim certainty that this revelation will not exist in a vacuum, that it will inevitably pull Brooke back into the emotional vortex, reopening old wounds and reigniting debates about who truly belongs with Ridge. And the knowledge exhausts him because he knows how destructive those cycles have been, not just for Ridge but for everyone who loves him. Yet even as Eric anticipates the chaos to come, he cannot ignore the deeper reckoning demanded by this moment, the uncomfortable truth that Taylor's betrayal forces the family to confront the hypocrisy of their moral narratives, the way certain transgressions have been excused or condemned depending on who committed them. And Eric feels a profound sense of reckoning as he realizes that this affair shatters the illusion of moral high ground Taylor once occupied, leveling the playing field in a way that will permanently alter how her choices are judged and remembered. Ridge's devastation deepens not through dramatic confrontation but through quiet withdrawal, a slow emotional collapse that Eric recognizes as grief in its purest form, grief for the future he believed in, for the partner he trusted, and for the version of himself who thought he had finally found peace after years of turmoil. And Eric aches watching his son navigate that grief, knowing there is no advice that can lessen it, no reassurance that can undo the damage. As the reality of the affair sinks in, Eric also becomes acutely aware of the collateral damage. The children who will feel the shockwaves of this revelation, the extended family members who will take sides, the employees and observers who will speculate and judge, and he feels an overwhelming weariness at the thought of managing yet another scandal. Because this one is not just salacious gossip but a deeply personal implosion that will reverberate for years. Taylor's attempts to explain herself grow more desperate as she realizes that remorse alone cannot repair what has been broken, and Eric sees in her eyes a dawning understanding of the permanence of her choices, the realization that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed no matter how sincere the apology, and he feels a complex mix of empathy and anger. Because while he understands human frailty, he cannot excuse the calculated secrecy that allowed the affair to persist unchecked. The confession changes everything not only because it ends a relationship but because it forces a re-evaluation of identity, compelling Ridge to ask himself whether he has been chasing an idealized version of love that no longer exists, and Eric to question whether the family's endless cycles of forgiveness and repetition are a form of emotional stagnation rather than resilience. As the hours pass and the conversation fractures into fragments of accusation, regret, and silence, Eric becomes painfully aware that this is not a moment with a clean resolution, that there will be no dramatic closure, only the slow, grinding process of disentangling lives that were once tightly woven together, and he braces himself for the long aftermath, the sleepless nights, the therapy sessions, the public scrutiny, and the private moments of doubt that will follow. Ridge eventually leaves the room, not in anger but in quiet resignation, and the sight of his retreating figure breaks something in Eric, because it symbolizes the loss of innocence that even adulthood does not fully prepare one for, the realization that love, no matter how passionately believed in, is always vulnerable to human weakness. Left alone with Taylor, Eric feels the weight of unspoken judgment pressing down on them both, and he finally speaks not as a patriarch managing a crisis but as a man confronting another human being's failure, telling her with painful honesty that while he understands loneliness and temptation, he cannot absolve the betrayal that has now inflicted irreparable harm on his son, and his words land heavily, stripped of theatrics, resonating with a truth that cannot be denied. Taylor listens, tears streaming, and for the first time there is no defense, no justification, only the stark acknowledgement of loss, and Eric realizes that in this moment, everyone involved is grieving something different, Ridge grieving love, Taylor grieving trust and identity, and himself grieving the belief that experience alone can prevent history from repeating itself. The truth about Taylor does not simply alter one relationship. It reshapes the emotional map of the entire family, redrawing boundaries and redefining alliances in ways that will be felt long after the initial shock fades. And Eric knows that the road ahead will be fraught with difficult choices, painful conversations, and moments where forgiveness will be tested against self-respect. As he contemplates what comes next, Eric is struck by the sobering clarity that this confession has stripped away comforting illusions, forcing everyone to confront the raw, uncomfortable reality that love is not sustained by ideals alone but by daily acts of honesty, and that without those, even the most passionate connections are vulnerable to collapse. The devastation Ridge experiences will not resolve quickly, and Eric understands that healing, if it comes at all, will require time, distance, and a willingness to accept that some endings are not failures but necessary reckonings. In learning the truth about Taylor, Eric also learns something unsettling about himself and his family, that their greatest enemy has never been external rivals or corporate threats but the quiet compromises they make with truth in the name of emotional survival. And as he stands in the aftermath of the confession, surrounded by the echoes of a world that has irrevocably changed, Eric knows with absolute certainty that this moment will be remembered not for the scandal itself but for the way it forced every person involved to confront the cost of deception, the fragility of trust, and the painful, inescapable truth that even the strongest worlds can collapse when built on secrets. The days that follow unfold with a strange, disorienting quality, as though time itself has been bent by the gravity of Taylor's confession, and Eric finds himself moving through familiar spaces that no longer feel anchored in reality, because every room, every hallway, every shared memory now carries an invisible fracture running through it, A reminder that something fundamental has broken and cannot simply be restored by silence or routine. Ridge becomes distant in a way that alarms Eric, not with anger or public confrontation but with a quiet withdrawal that suggests a man retreating to protect what remains of his sense of self. And Eric recognizes this pattern with painful clarity, knowing that when Ridge stops fighting, stops arguing, stops demanding explanations, it means the devastation has reached a level where words no longer offer relief. Taylor, meanwhile, oscillates between remorse and desperation, reaching out, explaining herself repeatedly as though repetition might somehow change the outcome. But Eric understands that what she fails to grasp is that the damage lies not only in what she did but in the erosion of certainty, the destruction of Ridge's ability to trust his own perceptions, and that is a wound far more difficult to heal than heartbreak alone. The family begins to fracture along predictable yet heartbreaking lines, with some offering cautious sympathy to Taylor, others expressing quiet outrage on Ridge's behalf, and Eric feels the exhausting pull of his role as mediator, aware that every attempt to soothe one side risks alienating the other, and yet doing nothing feels like a betrayal of his responsibility as a father and patriarch. Brooke's name surfaces almost immediately, whispered at first, then spoken openly, and Eric feels a familiar dread settle in his chest, because he knows that regardless of intention, Brooke's presence in Ridge's emotional orbit will be interpreted as both refuge and provocation, a reminder of unresolved history that complicates an already volatile situation. Ridge's interactions with Brooke are tentative, restrained, and painfully cautious, not fueled by passion but by a shared understanding of emotional fallout, and Eric observes this dynamic with mixed emotions, recognizing that while Brooke may offer comfort, she also embodies the cycle of repetition that has haunted Ridge's life for decades, and Eric fears that without careful introspection, Ridge may once again find himself repeating patterns rather than breaking them. The confession continues to reverberate through professional spaces as well, affecting business decisions, creative collaborations, and public perception, and Eric becomes acutely aware of how intertwined personal lives and corporate identity truly are, realizing that scandals of the heart have consequences far beyond private pain, shaping reputations, alliances, and the very narrative the family presents to the world. Taylor's role within the family and company shifts almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing clarity as trust once granted automatically now requires justification, and Eric watches her grapple with the loss of credibility, understanding that while forgiveness may be possible, authority rooted in moral certainty is far harder to reclaim. Ridge's devastation deepens into something quieter and more dangerous, a numbness that unsettles Eric because it suggests unresolved grief rather than healing, and he makes tentative attempts to reach his son, offering not advice but presence, understanding that sometimes the most meaningful support lies in silent companionship rather than solutions. In these moments, Eric reflects on his own history, on the mistakes he made, the affairs he justified, the truths he avoided, and he is struck by the uncomfortable realization that Taylor's betrayal forces him to confront his own legacy, the patterns he modeled, and the ways in which his choices may have normalized emotional duplicity within the family. This introspection is painful but necessary, and Eric begins to understand that this crisis demands more than damage control, more than strategic conversations and public reassurances. It demands a fundamental shift in how the family approaches truth, accountability, and emotional honesty. Taylor's attempts at redemption become more deliberate, marked by therapy sessions, candid conversations, and a willingness to accept consequences without resistance. And while Eric respects the effort, he remains acutely aware that redemption is a process, not a declaration, and that Ridge may never reach a place where reconciliation is possible or even desirable. Ridge himself embarks on a quiet journey of self-examination, questioning not only Taylor's actions but his own choices, his repeated pursuit of idealized love, and his tendency to seek certainty in relationships that promise emotional stability but often mask unresolved conflict. And Eric watches this evolution with cautious hope, recognizing that while pain has precipitated this reckoning, it may also offer an opportunity for growth that years of comfort never could. The children are inevitably drawn into the aftermath, asking questions that reveal their own confusion and hurt, and Eric feels a profound sadness as he realizes that despite his best efforts, the cycle of emotional upheaval continues to touch another generation, reinforcing his resolve to advocate for greater honesty and transparency moving forward, even when it is uncomfortable or inconvenient. Public scrutiny intensifies as it always does, and Eric becomes adept once again at navigating media narratives, offering measured statements while guarding the family's privacy. Yet he cannot escape the irony that no amount of public relations can undo the private devastation that has already occurred. Taylor's secret lover, once hidden in the shadows, becomes a symbol of betrayal rather than a person, and Eric notes how quickly individuality is erased in the face of scandal, how the human complexity of all involved is flattened into a narrative of right and wrong, a simplification that may satisfy public appetite but fails to capture the emotional reality. As weeks turn into months, the initial shock gives way to a quieter, more persistent ache, and Eric realizes that this is the true test of resilience, not surviving the moment of revelation but enduring the long, uncertain aftermath where decisions must be made without the clarity of crisis, where forgiveness, distance, or permanent separation must be chosen deliberately rather than reactively. Ridge eventually articulates what Eric has sensed all along, that while he does not harbor hatred toward Taylor, he cannot envision a future built on the remnants of a trust so thoroughly dismantled. And hearing this, Eric feels both sorrow and relief, sorrow for the loss of what once was and relief that his son is choosing self-respect over familiarity. Taylor receives this truth with quiet devastation, and in that moment, Eric sees not a villain but a deeply flawed human being confronting the irreversible consequences of her actions. And while empathy softens his anger, it does not erase his conviction that accountability must remain central to any path forward. The family begins